I grew up with my sister living in a large house, along with my mother and father. It was a big house, but was such fun to run around in with just me and my sister. We did everything together. We'd watch TV or just sit around with coloring books, build stuff with blocks, and sometimes even have her read stories to me. She would always be the last to leave my room at night, and the first to be by my side when I would wake up. We were inseparable every day. I couldn't imagine life without her at that time. Even when I would go to school, she would be the first person I'd run to, just to talk about my day and all the activities I did. She would always listen to my every word. She kept me out of trouble, and sometimes would be the trouble to pull little pranks on our parents. One day, I woke up and I was kind of stunned to find she wasn't there to say good morning, Bug, like how she would always do. But that morning was different. I went to my parents asking where Katie was, and all they would say was, "I don't know, sweetie," which I found really odd. I started to feel scared for whatever reason cause she wasn't there, and I acted out in crying fits, asking for Katie. Where Katie? I want Katie. When nighttime came around, she wasn't there to put me to sleep. And of course, I acted out again and again. This went on for weeks until it was time my parents would take me to a child psychologist. I kept asking about Katie, no matter who I talked to, because she was my world and my everything. She was my safety. But it turns out Katie didn't exist at all. But I knew she was real, no matter how much they tried to convince me she wasn't. I thought back to all the times me and Katie played, watched TV, colored in my books, and even read stories at night in my bed. All those times I asked my parents about Katie. That whole time, they thought I was just making up an imaginary friend and played along with it whenever I would mention or acknowledge her. But they were just doing so to keep my imagination sharp. They had started to suspect that I was developing a type of schizophrenia, hence why the child psychologist was an option. For years, I seen the psychologist and told him about Katie and how she looked, talked, her age, and all the basics, but over time, I somehow grown to accept that she was just make-believe like they said she was. Then I got older. I eventually grew out of the phase and forgot about Katie altogether up until I became an adult. One afternoon, I was sorting through old junk in my parents' house when I came across an old drawing of me and Katie that I had made. We were holding hands and reading a book as looked, and all these memories came flooding back. I remembered Katie and I felt a sense of comfort overwhelm me as I sat down looking at that drawing in the garage. And that's when I started to realize something. I took out my phone and looked up some old town records along with the address of the house I grew up in. It turns out that 10 years before we had moved into this house was another house that burned down. A mother and her 2 kids made it out safely, but one child didn't. 9-year-old Katie died in the fire, trapped in her own room. I remember always wondering why Katie's face was pale and red on one side of her face, hair stringy and wet, but never questioned out loud, because I was a naive and thought that's just how she was, cause she was always around me for as long as I can remember. I wasn't schizophrenic, wasn't delusional or crazy. None of those things they said I was. She wasn't even an imaginary friend of mine that I just made up. Katie was a ghost who I thought was my sister that whole time. There are days when I go to visit my mother since my dad passed. I'll be alone walking down those long hallways, and I'll feel a little hand holding mine. I'd stop and close my eyes and whisper, "Hello, sister," and we'd walk into a room, and just like that, she'd be gone. I like to think she's watching over my mother when I'm not around. It brings a comfort to know that Katie still cares and is still there. I work nights at a hospital on the janitorial staff. It's a pretty easy job, but the place really gives me the creeps. I've been working here for a little over a month, and the reason it makes me feel uneasy is the freaking ghost stories. I hear the nurses and doctors talk about them all the time. Random doors slamming in the hallways, shadow figures, and another set of footsteps following behind you on the stairwells. All these rumors really make me feel uneasy when I'm mopping up a dimly lit floor of the hospital. The money is good, and it's the only thing keeping me going. But something happened the other night that makes me want to quit. It all started a week ago as I prepared for my shift. Everyone in the West Wing was talking about a patient, a teenage girl recovering from a terrible accident. According to reports, there was an electrical fire in the poor girl's room, and she barely escaped alive. Unfortunately, the girl was left with severe burns all over her body and was recovering in a room all wrapped up after an emergency treatment. My heart ached for the patient. I'm not hardened like these nurses and doctors, so hearing things like that really gets to me. The girl's the same age as my little sister and I couldn't help but feel sad about what happened to her. I moved out of our parents' place a year ago, and in the process of living my own life, I haven't made much time to go back to visit. I shook the thoughts out of my head. I had to leave the personal stuff at the door and try to be professional. I winced when I was assigned to the West Wing that night, but I got my mop ready and was ready to go. The work was routine, with nothing out of the ordinary. I cleaned the restrooms, wiped down the counters, and organized the nurse stations. I yawned, checking the time to see that it was nearly 2 a.m. I had some extra time and knew I was breaking rules, but I was so curious that I got into the elevator and went to see the girl. I made my way up as I towed my janitorial cart, and I got to the girl's floor. The hallways were dimmed with only a few fluorescent lights on. Everything was so quiet, and my cart's squeaks echoed as I stepped forward. I looked towards the nurse's station to see a woman typing away at one of the computers. I slowly walked around. All the patients' doors were closed except for one. I made my way over to see someone lying on a bed. All these wires connected to different machines were hooked to a thin frame covered head to toe in white bandages. I just stood there for a moment and just stared, hoping that this girl would recover. "Excuse me. Can I help you?" The woman at the nurse's station called out to me. I turned and apologized, but the woman stopped me. "What a horrible thing, huh?" She spoke, and I walked towards her, propping myself up on the counter. The girl was home alone when it happened. Her parents are out of town, but they'll be here in the morning. I let out a sigh. Jesus, the woman must have sensed how I felt and asked me if I was okay. But before I could answer, I got a call from my walkie-talkie. Duty calls. I muttered and pushed my cart back towards the elevator. I went down to help sanitize some of the patient rooms, which didn't take very long. This floor was almost completely empty, so that made things much easier. As I was wrapping up one of the rooms, I stepped out towards my cart that was in the hallway. It was so damn quiet, until I heard the elevator doors open. I glanced over, and you can imagine my shock when I saw that thin bandaged girl standing all alone in the elevator. We were only a few feet apart. I stood there looking in awe as she stared at me. I could hear her raspy breathing, and the light above us began to flicker. "Hey, you shouldn't be walking around like this," I said, trying to sound authoritative, but something about this situation was making me feel uneasy. "It's just a hurt little girl," I eventually told myself. Here, let's get you back up to your room, okay?" I told her. I simply stepped in the elevator. The door shut behind me, and I pressed the button to her floor. We both stood motionless, the elevator groaning as it moved upward. A smell struck me, causing me to fight back the urge to vomit. The space around us was filled with the smell of burnt meat. I looked towards the girl. I hadn't noticed until then that she was facing me. She stood in an awkward stance. Her legs were bent and her head was askew. There weren't any bandages over her mouth and eyes, so I could see her damaged lips open as she continued her raspy breathing. I could see her eyes. The irises and pupils were completely white. I opened my mouth to speak, but the taste of smoke assaulted me. I began to cough uncontrollably as my throat was filled with unseen fumes. Sweat began to pour out of me. The elevator felt so fucking hot. The girl began to move towards me. I could hear a sizzle with each of her steps. She opened her mouth and began to scream. "Help! Help me!" She grabbed my arms and I felt a burning sensation from her touch. I tried to shake myself from her grip, but she overpowered me. "Help me!" She screamed again, and behind her I saw Flames. The whole elevator was being consumed by a hellish inferno. Her bandages were touched by a cinder and began to catch on fire. She was burning in front of me, the white bandages quickly catching flame and disintegrating before my eyes. Underneath her wraps was melted flesh, and her mouth was opened to let out an agonized wail. The flames went down her neck, down her arms, and ran up towards me. I watched helplessly as the fire started to eat me alive. I screamed with all my might until, ping, the noise caught me off guard. I looked around to see that the elevator was completely empty. The doors opened and I was on the girls' floor. In the hallway were some nurses and someone walking towards me with a gurney. The person was covered, but I knew who it was. The woman from early on was standing there, and I walked over to her. She explained to me that the girl had just passed away. I was drenched in sweat, and I touched both my arms. I could still feel the searing burn. The woman looked at me and grabbed my hand, asking me if I was okay. I didn't know how to respond. I just experienced something so intense. I stared back at the elevator and the doors had already shut. I told the woman that I must have been tired or something, but she gripped my hand tighter. She assured me that these things happen sometime at this hospital, that it's just another ghost story for the place. This one is a little long, so apologies for that. But if you last to the end, I promise it's worth it. I'm 29 now, but this happened to me when I was around 13. I was in an old family house that we still have, and I think I was just unlucky to be there and unlucky to wake up when I did. To start with, I need to let you know about this place. This is a house that was built literally room by room in the center of a small village, far from anything else. I can tell you that it started being built in the mid-1800s, and back then, when you wanted to make your home bigger, you'd either build it or you'd just buy a room from the house next to yours and connect it to your house. Easy. This is what my great-grandfather did over and over and over again until we were left with this massive house we know today. I've done the math with my grandma, and we think you'd be able to fit about 30 people in there to spend the night. The whole. I want my house to be bigger, so I'll buy a room next door idea. Seems really funny now, but the problem with it is you can't know what might have happened in the room you're buying, and no one really thought about that at the time. So this is a big family home, and for as long as I can remember, every Christmas we go there and have a great time with the entire family. The whole postcard family picture around the fire and all. Eventually, since the house is so old, it started decaying. So my grandma decided work needed to be done there, and we started going more and more during the works. This is when my story comes to life. Back then, my other grandfather, on the other side of the family, wasn't doing too well after my grandmother's death. So we went around with him everywhere on holidays to get his mind off things. This particular time, my parents decided to take him with us to spend some days at this house while my living grandmother and my dad supervised the works being done. Everything seemed completely normal when we got there. Because of the works being done though, my usual bedroom wasn't available, so I ended up having to sleep with my grandfather in the smallest and creepiest bedroom the house had. I say had because since then it has been turned into a bathroom, but back then it was still a tiny bedroom with no windows. 2 old wooden doors instead of one that would come together, but not actually close. 2 old single beds with old creaking chicken wire for a mattress base and mattresses that were probably the first invention after the old hay ones. Needless to say, I hated the bedroom. It used to be my grandmother's and great aunt's bedroom, and then my father's cousins after that. And it still had all their creepy toys and plushies, and an old blue and white painting of my great-grandfather that I swear wouldn't take its eyes off me every time I came by it. That shit would freak me out. That particular first night, I wasn't very happy with having to sleep in the bedroom. Not only it was super creepy, but it also opened into an old, cold hallway that would echo no matter what furniture was in it, because every wall, ceiling, or floor was stone. To make things worse, my great-grandfather was a doctor, the only one around the area. So there was this glass cabinet in one of the corners full of old vials of medical liquids and syringes that he probably used in his days of work. In any case, I was creeped out by the fact I had to sleep there, but I didn't want it to show. So I just accepted my fate and told myself it was fine. Nighttime came. Me and my grandfather went to bed, and after a bit I could hear my grandmother and parents going out of the living room, turning off the lights and going to their usual rooms on the opposite side of the house. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep because of how much I detested having to be there, but not hours long. At some point, I could hear my grandfather's heavier breath on the bed next to mine, which meant he was already out. Eventually, I put on a YouTube video on my phone, put it next to my head just under the pillow, covered myself up to the top of my head, leaving only my nose out so I didn't have to breathe the stale air inside the covers. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up to possibly the worst night of my life. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up to a nightmare so bad that it felt like it was coming through to reality. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced the same. In this nightmare, I could see only a gray background, sort of blurred, like I needed glasses, but didn't have them on me. This blurred gray background was just there, sitting still when I started hearing this little girl's laugh in the distance. Eventually, I started seeing the faded silhouette of a little girl in a dress, a dark shape showing up blurred in the middle of the gray blurred background. I panicked, took in a massive deep breath, and when I woke up from it, I could almost swear I heard this laugh in the house. What I actually heard, though, wasn't a little girl laughing. My head was still covered. I was still in the same position, so I thought not long had gone by. I took some breaths to try to calm myself down and made my phone's screen turn on. It was around 2:20 a.m. A heavy boot step echoed in the hallway right in front of the bedroom doors. I stopped breathing, stopped thinking, stopped inking, stopped everything while my brain tried to process what the hell I just heard. Another footstep. I instantly covered my phone's screen to smother the light and froze under the covers. At that point, I considered myself lucky with how thick they were. Another step, and another followed. This time going a bit farther, and farther, until I could tell they were at the end of the corridor. My body was frozen solid. I was so horrified that any breath I took would attract whoever this was, that any attempts to make my breathing more silent were just resulting in hiccups of air coming in and out of me. At the same time, I was trying to rationalize this and convince myself that this was only my dad walking around at night too. To do what? Another footstep and another one, coming closer again. Please be him. Please be him. The footsteps were too heavy to be my grandmother or my mother, so it had to be him. Deep down though, I knew my dad's footsteps didn't sound like that. Another footstep and another. And they kept coming right up to the doors, and then back away from them all the way until the end of the corridor, each step echoing and telling me exactly where whoever this was standing. Every time they went away, my body would relax and hope and pray for them to just go out the door. Every time they turned around and started coming closer again, my body would tense up until frozen solid, to the point that I would sweat and ache at the same time, and would yet be kept completely unable to relax or even move. The steps went away once more. In my thoughts, I was almost praying for them to go, and closer again. By now, my muscles felt like I had just finished a full workout that lasted for hours, and I was still completely unable to relax and let go of this complete and unrelenting panic. This time though, the fear multiplied by 10. I could feel my eyes widening, because suddenly and slowly, I heard the bedroom doors creak and whine open. I was almost crying, muffling my breath when the footsteps slowly and heavily made their way between my bed and my grandfather's. How was he not awake from this? My panic was making me rage at my grandfather for not waking up and scaring this person away. I could feel their presence just standing there between us, deciding what to do next. And then, slowly, the footsteps turned around, walked outside the bedroom, into the hallway, and all the way to the end of it again. I was completely exhausted by now. It had to have been like 1 hour since I woke up because of this. I clicked my phone screen on. I remember thinking I had to be seeing it wrong, or maybe the time was wrong on my phone. Wishful thinking. The footsteps came back, going slowly up and down the hallway. By now, every single muscle of my body was hurting, exhausted, and at the end of what they could take. And I couldn't believe it was still 4 hours at least until the first sign of light outside could scare this person or thing away. Footsteps up and down the corridor, slowly torturing my heart, making it pound harder when it came closer, and a little less hard when it went away, like it was pulling my heartstrings, and I had no say in it. Eventually, from the extreme exhaustion the panic was causing me, I drifted off into sleep. I have no idea if this was a self-preservation response from my body to allow me to rest a little bit, but when I woke up again, nothing had changed. Slow, heavy footsteps were going up and down the corridor, coming closer, too close to the bedroom doors, and then moving away again. One of the times they moved away, I clicked at my phone in panic, hoping it was almost daytime. It was almost like I had fainted for a bit and was back awake as soon as my body could bear it. The footsteps turned around at the end of the corridor, then back to me. Closer, 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 closer. Bedroom doors creak and the footsteps are back inside the bedroom, and this heavy presence is back standing between me and my grandfather. I couldn't even sob. I could take in air, which I would otherwise have done uncontrollably. I am not kidding when I tell you that this went on for hours. To me, it felt like it had been days without a ray of sunshine coming through the bedroom doors that kept being left ajar. I felt like my body just couldn't take it anymore. And yet this panic would not loosen the grip on my muscles, until suddenly the footsteps just ceased. I perked my ears up. I couldn't be sure this was true. Was it done? My muscles loosened their grip on me, and the full exhaustion from everything that happened hit me even harder than before. I clicked my phone awake. Thank fucking God. I held myself still for a little longer, and when I was sure there was no presence in the bedroom and no footsteps in the hallway, I turned in bed. The chicken wire under the mattress whined at this while I lowered the covers just enough to be able to take a peek at the doors. They were sitting still, both slightly ajar, and the distinct light of the start of the day was coming through. I felt complete relaxation and bliss. One more footstep sounded through the house. It made me jump and instantly cover my head again. Then another footstep and another one. These were lighter and faster, like a happy energy roaming around the house. It was my grandma. I got up immediately, refusing to lay there another second, and just joined her in her morning routines, even going out with her to buy bread at 6:30, as I welcomed the thought of leaving the house like never before. I never told her what happened, though she did ask why I was up so early, since she spent more time in the house than me and her bedroom was so far away from that hell of a hallway. I decided not to make her worried. I did check all the doors and windows before we left, to check if anyone would have been able to come into the house unnoticed, but found nothing. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside as they should be. In the days after that, I absolutely refused to sleep in the same bedroom, and instead slept in my grandma's bedroom, which generally wouldn't have been much better, because right in front of the bed where I had to sleep, there was this huge Narnia, like wardrobe with a massive mirror in the front that always scared the shit out of me. But at that time, that was infinitely better than going through what I had just gone through again. This bedroom isn't there anymore. During the works, it was eventually turned into a bathroom, which I'm actually glad was done. There are 10 other bathrooms in the house, so I never have to stick around that one for too long ever again.